Selamat pagi pemirsa di Indonesia. Good morning, our friends in Indonesia, and good evening for us in the US. Nindyo in New York City, Adrianus Yosia in DC. And well, thank you, Jamie. Now we have our first English speaker here on Theology, Jamie Pitts. Thank you, Jamie, for joining us. First of all, I want to introduce to you about our guest speaker tonight. So, Jamie Pitts is an associate professor in Anabaptist studies at Anabaptist-Mennonite Biblical Seminary, the seminary where I'm studying now, and the director of the IMS, Institute of Mennonite Studies. And IMS, you can correct me, Jamie, if I'm wrong, is the Publishing and Research Institute under IMBS. Am I correct? That's correct, right? Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. So, and Jamie holds a bachelor degree from University of Texas, MD from Fuller Theological Seminary, and PhD from Edinburgh University. So again, Jamie, we are so grateful that you are able to share with us tonight, and I believe that it will be a great blessings for many of our viewers in Indonesia. And anyway, Nindi also can correct me if I'm wrong. This is our first live session ever in English, right?
Indeed. Yes, you are right. So thank you, Dr. Jamie Bates, for your willingness to be with us.
It's a huge privilege for us to having you here. So we already had one session in English, but it was a recording session.
Okay.
I think it's last year with Ben Gushen.
Ben Gushen.
Oh, great.
From Harvard University. And I also want to spoil something here, that this month we will also have another session in English with Professor Joanne Mary Terrell. That's right, right?
That's right. Yes, wow. Joanne Mary Terrell from Chicago Theological Seminary.
Yes, and she is the ex-student of James Cone,
the
father of Black liberation theology. And I just heard from Nindyo the other day that his professor, Janine Hill Fletcher from Fordham, already confirms her willingness to share with us on Theology. So it is really, really a great blessings for us on Theology. So, okay, we will continue our conversation. And before I give time for you, Jamie, I just want to show an article that I saw several weeks ago that I think related with our topics today. Can I share it? Share screen, right?
Yep. Share screen.
Share screen and application window. Okay. So yeah. Okay, so this is the article that I saw several weeks ago that really provoked me from a pastor named William H. Lamar IV. And the article titled, "It's Not Just the Coronavirus. Bad Theology is Killing Us." Bad theology is killing us. And the interesting thing about this article is because in this article, he highlighted several things that interesting to me. For him, what is happening now, especially not only in the US, but also around the world, but especially in the US, is not just because of the virus, but because of theology. So I will quote here several of his sentences. I want to stop sharing now, and I will share you another slides. Yeah. So here are some. Okay, is that big enough?
No, it's still small, I think.
Is it small? Okay, I can. Okay, is that enough now?
Yes.
It's better, right?
Yeah,
it's better. Okay, so for example, he says in his article, what kind of God talk makes possible a refusal to provide the universal health care that may have mitigated this crisis? What kind of God talk makes possible a refusal to invest the money necessary to end homelessness? What kind of God talks makes possible the racializing of criminality and poverty? What kind of God talk gives political power to science-denying policymakers? The answers white evangelical God talk. The injustices that many communities are experiencing as a result of the novel coronavirus are inextricably linked to this theology. The evidence is irrefutable. And he also mentioned here two other things that really provoke myself. He says here, and it's why I argue that white evangelical theology's settler colonial impulse fosters the condition for the novel coronavirus to thrive. And he also says, in the white evangelical imagination, certain bodies will never belong. So actually, friends, here in his article, he talks about the deaths and the impact of coronavirus, COVID-19 in the US. That's really, really huge. And he says it's not just about health condition, it's not just about the political system, but it's also relating with theology. So Jamie, what is your opinion regarding this situation now? Why theology? Why theology still impact people's life, especially in COVID-19?
Yeah, well, thanks, Bernardine. It's a great introduction to this question and problem. I mean, I think Reverend Lamar put his finger on the pulse there that, theology, I think if we think about theology not simply as a set of sentences about God that are abstracted from the rest of the world, but rather if we think about theology as the basic convictions in which we make sense of our lives, then it is not just possible, but it is a fact that Christianity, European and North American, white North American Christianity has really perfected a form of theology that incredibly distorts the vision, the way of being in the world of a whole class of people, millions and millions of people. And so what Reverend Lamar in that article you just read from is calling us to is, and I say us here, me, this is my background. So I come from a white evangelical background. And so that's theology I have to own and wrestle with. And so part of, I would say, my journey with God, it has to be a journey of repentance and learning to hear how my theological outlook has been misshapen by the patterns of settler colonialism that I inherited, by the patterns of enslavement of other humans that I'm an inheritor of. And it's not just, one of the lies that we tell ourselves, and I think we probably do it all over the world, but I know that white Americans have a special ability to do this, is to say, well, that's not my problem. That was my ancestors. But that's because we're incapable of thinking historically. And so we don't think about how the conditions that make our lives possible still very actively rest on settler colonialism, the genocide of indigenous Americans, and the enslavement of Africans. And of course, much since the days of slavery. And these are enabling conditions for our ways of life, including our ways of thought. And so what Reverend Lamar is calling people like me to is a life of repentance. And that's hard, but it must be taken up. So I don't know if you want me to kind of go into my presentation now. Okay.
Sure.
That was just my response to those good words from that you shared from Reverend Lamar. But thank you so much for that. And I do want to say, as I transition here to my presentation, it really is an honor to be here. The names you're sharing, who else you've had on this or having, I feel very humbled to be here. Bernardine has become a great friend over these last years. And so when he invited me to do this, I was very honored. And because I've seen from him and Nenjo and others, this project online for the last 2 years or so. I've seen it on Facebook. I've been really impressed with the kind of work. I mean, this is this is an incredible theological project that you are engaged in, and I really just encourage you to keep up this excellent work. Obviously, I don't know. I'm not in the Indonesian context, and I don't know a whole lot about that context. And I'm hoping that we can have some good questions where you educate, in comments and conversation where you educate me some. But I'm also I can see just the incredible impact you're making through this project. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So let's see. I think I can do this pretty easily. So what I want to do is, so the title of this this session, and the title of my presentation is Doing Theology in the Time of COVID-19. And so I'm interested in this question of what it means to actually think theologically. So I'm not an expert on COVID-19. I'm not a doctor or a scientist. I'm not a medical ethicist that might be doing lots of detailed research on this, but I am, like all of you, someone who is affected by this, someone who has been reading and is interested to learn about what's going on and reflecting on this as a theologian. And so what I'm planning to share here is not a last word at all by any means of what it means to do theology. It's hopefully an opening of a conversation and an opening of at least one helpful path that might be available in this time of COVID-19. So I think it's important to spend a little bit of time just reflecting on what COVID-19 is. And there's a lot we could do here. Of course, we could bring in all sorts of theory. And I want to be careful not to give the impression that I'm simply reporting just, well, here's the facts as they are. Again, I'm not an expert, but I'm a hopefully somewhat informed person who is affected by this. But it's also the case that as a theologian, I'm bringing certain interests. And so some of the way I've shaped this, even the presentation of what COVID-19 is from my theological perspective. So what I'm doing here is trying to set up an engagement with the reality of COVID-19 with theology. So COVID-19 is, in the first place, it's a zoonotic coronavirus. And that word zoonotic essentially means it's a virus that's passed between two humans from other animals. And this is not the first zoonotic coronavirus. SARS and MERS were also zoonotic coronaviruses. And that's worth thinking about. I'm not going to get into this too much, but this is not the first time that we've had something like this. But it's obviously the extent, the intensity, the global reach of it is fresher. But it's important to think historically about viruses, about disease. In the Americas, with essentially the history of settler colonialism really being opened because Europeans brought diseases that just wiped out millions of people. This is not, I think here in the United States, many middle class and wealthy white people are shocked. We're not capable of being touched by disease, but it wasn't only, it was 100 years ago there was a major, only 100 years ago there was a major disease, the so-called Spanish flu of 1918. But it's also the case that our ancestors infected in a devastating way the original inhabitants of these lands. So this disease or this virus mostly affects the respiratory tract and is spread by respiratory droplets. I'm not going to be able to get into a lot of detail about this or really any other particular fact, but I do think it's interesting to think about. and Pentecost, the time of thinking about the Spirit, the one who is eternally spirated, that we are dealing with a respiratory infection. And of course, we also are looking at the murder of George Floyd, whose breath was extinguished through this police officer kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So that's really worth it. Some of these connections are worth thinking about. The global character of COVID-19 needs to be kept in mind, and this has of course been politicized by the President of the United States as blaming China, and part of the interesting thing here, and I don't know what this looks like in Indonesia, but in the relation, this is also complicating relations between Africa and China, and so the blame is going many different directions, and lots of waves of colonial and other kinds of exploitative history are related to how we think of the geography of the coronavirus. As of today, there are over 7 million confirmed cases and over 403,000 deaths in the world, and most of those are elderly. Mm-hmm. And of course, the United States has a quarter of those deaths. Mm-hmm. So, thinking, I want to reflect on some of the background conditions or background features. And again, we could spend all night talking about, or all morning talking about any one of these issues, but just to kind of touch on them briefly, because I do think it's important to have, it's easy to think, oh my gosh, there's a pandemic, but what set the stage for the pandemic? So one of the things, of course, is the ecological devastation, in particular deforestation and urbanization that has brought humans into closer contact with other animals. The animals that are surviving deforestation and being able to thrive in urban environments are the ones that are tending to be the carriers of these coronaviruses. And so the way that our global ways of life and patterns of industrialization, urbanization, and so forth are destroying the environment is rebounding on us. And that's quite significant to think about. The incredible intensity and spread of global supply chains, global finance and travel, especially since the 1970s, is a huge factor in what's made this a global pandemic. And that needs to be kept into account. There's also, of course, part of the background is this we're in a moment, also in some ways since the 1970s, I should be careful because that's talking, the language of democratic crisis is more, in some ways, part of the European, Western European and North American and South American story. But an authoritarian resurgence, of course, Trump in this country, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and many other kinds of authoritarian regimes. The information is, of course, a significant part of this, and how information is shared, and what sources or what the mechanisms for finding trustworthy information are. And those have, to some extent, broken down, of course. And that's been a significant factor in the spread of this disease. Economic equality is a lack of healthcare in many societies around the world. Those go hand in hand. And the economic inequalities have just been widening. They widened massively after the last global economic crash a decade ago. And if history is an indicator, they will continue to do so after this. You also have, as part of what I'm calling this democratic crisis or series of crises, you have a number of different claims to specific identities, and on the basis of those identities, a claim to to have a voice and participate in democratic process. And because of this authoritarian resurgence, many of those claims to participation are being crushed. And so some of the backlash also kind of mimics and mirrors and says, oh, well, you know, I'm white and I'm a white American. I should have my own nation, as if I don't already. And so, but there's around the world, there's different groups of people and individuals who are claiming on the basis of distinct identities, identifying the way that they have been marginalized on the basis of those identities, and making claims for democratic participation. And you know, the success there is very mixed, of course, but that's part of this ongoing crisis in which the coronavirus has been unleashed. So what has happened over the last few months since, let's say, late February, early to mid-March, when societies around the world began to go into some kind of quarantine? Well, I'm telling a narrative which is somewhat U.S. focused because of course, the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others who have been, other African Americans have been murdered by police officers. But those protests that it sparked in the U.S. have now also grown all around the world. And they've grown not just as a claim about U.S. politics, but as a claim about, again, some of those issues around identity, security, policing, democratic participation, that it's becoming a global phenomenon as well. So we've gone from a month ago where you were not supposed to leave your house to now you should leave your house so that you can stand in solidarity with the most marginalized peoples in our society. But backing up a little bit, I mean, the quarantine, you know, the science of quarantine was, you know, if you think back to 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago, that was the most heavily debated issue. Right. You know, what herd immunity, or what should we be doing? And it's still in many, and really in all parts of the world, it's still a huge debate. And so, and part of the issue there gets back to this question of fake news, of what kind of information you can trust. And so that's an important aspect when we think about the politics of the quarantine. There's a very human dimension here of, you know, can people be in their houses for indefinite periods of time, especially, again, when we think about identity and we think about power, especially we think about domestic violence, issues related to that. There's a whole set of issues that stay in your house, really, that kind of message really struggled to deal with. And so it set up this kind of political struggle that I'm describing here as your money or your life. You know, either you kind of give up in a country like the United States that has very little provision for, you know, very little social services. People were facing this, in some ways still are facing this question of, do I go to work or do I stay safe? And so I stay healthy. And so that's been politicized in this country, and I know in many other countries as well. And of course, I've already talked about the kind of shift in the last 2 weeks to face this other pandemic of police brutality and racism, and so a growth of global protest. So that's that. I just wanted to set the stage briefly in those terms, because I think it's important, whether you're coming from a kind of liberation methodology of the, you know, see, judge, and act, or the kind of, I think a similar methodology that I'm going to be employing here in a moment, of the drawing from the Theology of the Principalities and Powers. We need to pay attention to our world, and this is one of the things that, theologians often forget because we rightly pay attention to ancient arguments and the Bible and our texts, and we argue with one another, but we also need to be paying very close attention to our world. And that claim about theology can sometimes be articulated in a kind of non-theological way, but I think it's really a theological matter. This matter of attention. And hopefully in what I'm about to say, it'll become clear why paying attention to our world is actually a core theological commitment for us. But yeah, so I've done a lot of work with this framework for social analysis, which is sometimes called the Principalities and Powers. Theology, the Principalities and Powers. And this actually, to make a happy ecumenical moment here, this theology was really first developed by Reformed theologians, like Hendrik Berkhoff, the Dutch theologian, was probably the most famous person, but Jacques Ellul, other French Reformed theologian, many others. But Anabaptists have also taken it up and used it significantly. Walter Wink, Protestant theologian. More recently, there's been a couple of Ghanaian Protestant theologians, Esther Akwalatse is one of them, who have used this framework of theology for thinking about, how do we kind of, to use that liberation theology language again, how do we see clearly? How do we judge and think critically about what's going on, and how do we act? And of course, at every stage, we're drawing on our theological convictions in doing that. But this language of powers and principalities comes from the Pauline letters, so the ones that are unanimously attributed to Paul by New Testament scholars, as well as some of the ones that are debated, like Ephesians and Colossians. And it's, if you think about Romans 8, where Paul is talking about, neither heights nor depths can separate us. Or Romans 13, where Paul talks about these arche, these authorities that God has doing something with. We can debate. Or you think about First Corinthians 15, where Paul talks about Christ's these powers being, and there's debates about the translation here, but the powers being somehow kind of submitted to Christ's authority and then put at the throne of God. So somehow kind of undergoing some kind of transformation, perhaps. So I think that line about the heights and the depths, the names above all names and so forth. This is a really interesting kind of cosmology or vision of the world that we're getting that includes everything, and it's a way of thinking about the creation or the cosmos as structured. There's heights, there's depths. There's names, some of which are named above other names. This is a way of thinking about the world as structured. And some of those structures are physical. And that's, if Christ is the one, as in Colossians 1, in Colossians chapter 1, it talks about Christ being the one in whom all things hold together. So all these structures hold together in Christ. And again, if you think back with Romans 8, with this idea that, nothing, neither the heights nor the depths nor anything else can separate us from the love of God in Christ. That's good news, because it's not just the names. We need to be delivered from the names above all names, from the Trumps of the world, for instance. But we also, we know that in Indonesia, I think about earthquakes and tsunamis pretty well. We know those heights and depths. You can fall down a mountain. You can drown in the sea. So the heights and the depths have their own danger, even if we also can climb a mountain and swim in the sea and appreciate the grandeur of God in those We're fragile creatures, and there's dangers there. So this is a way, I think, of helping us think structurally, and then helping us think theologically about our world. So the physical structures of the world, the social structures, but also the emotional structures that constitute us as human beings, our spiritual structures, how we relate to God, and so forth. And the basic framework, and this again comes from this Dutch Reformed theologian Hendrik Berkhoff, is to think about these structures in terms of part of God's good creation. And, I think growing up, part of this toxic evangelical theology says that the creation is good and God created it all perfectly, and there's a fall, and at the fall, then everything changed, and all we have to do is go back to the beginning. That's the theology I grew up with, and that's incredibly toxic because it's actually deeply unbiblical, because it doesn't see that God's creativity is ongoing, and so God is always working with us in these structures. These structures, and we can think about our best science and think about whether it's Big Bang cosmology or evolutionary biology. Our structures are the structures that make up our world are constantly changing, and the changing structures, the fact that our world is structured and the fact that it's dynamic, that it's changing, is part of God's good creation. So being part of God's good creation is not going back to some original model. It's being part of ongoing change. But it is, I think, appropriate to make a distinction between the goodness of God's creation and the kind of, to use a classical Christian language, of sin or fall, and not thinking about that as a kind of something that happens in time where, there's people who do bad things all of a sudden. But to think about that as, the kind of realization of structural potential for violence. That potential is always there. And you can think about that in Genesis with the tree. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the representation of that structural possibility of violence and so forth. And so we can make moral distinctions among structures, and I think that's what's important about thinking about our structured world as good, but also as beset by sin. So there's different moral possibilities to realize in the structures of our world, and yet we also claim in this kind of narrative of the powers that God, and here we look at 1 Corinthians 15 again, or Colossians 1 and 2, to think about Christ's triumph over the powers, and this kind of apocalyptic vision of Christ. In Colossians 2, Christ unveils the powers, and the church, the community of those who participate in Christ, are called to participate in that, the renewal and transformation of the powers, even as we are transformed. There's a lot more to say about all of these, but for the sake of time, I'll keep moving and just want to kind of touch on each of these 3 points briefly, just to say kind of how this powers analysis helps us think about COVID-19. So here we're talking about COVID-19 and God's good creation. I hope you can see on this globe Indonesia. I picked a picture of the globe with Indonesia visible on it. Kind of under the clouds. But
there's a huge storm.
Yeah, there's a big storm there. But I think it's helpful in terms of, when we talk about seeing our world, our world is really, there's obviously so much wrong. There's so much violence. There's so much oppression. There's so much death. I think as we look at that, it's really helpful to have our vision shaped by this conviction that the world is fundamentally good. And, and as we think, well, what does that mean to talk about that in light of COVID-19? Well, there's actually good viruses. And this is something I didn't know until a couple weeks ago. And I heard somebody on a podcast say something about this. And then I looked it up when I was preparing this. And it's really interesting because, some of you may be aware that, in the last decade or so, a lot of attention has been paid, at least here in North America, to gut bacteria.
Yes,
and you need to have a healthy gut bacteria to be able to digest food and so forth. Well, it's also the case that in microbial environments or ecologies, that viruses can play important healthy parts in sustaining. So we actually have good viruses in our blood, on our skin, in our gut that are helping us function. And actually, none of us would be here without viruses because there is a virus that actually, when each human embryo is forming, that switches on and it makes embryos able to receive nutrients from the mother. So actually, embryological development human embryos depend on viruses for our exit. We would not be here without viruses. And viruses are used to help fight infections. Some viruses basically fight cancer cells. This isn't what we think about. But again, when we think about, I think it's helpful to think, when we want to think critically about something like COVID-19, to think to be careful enough to see, well, this particular, the structure of a virus actually can do some good things, and it has a place in God's good creation. And I'll touch on the others more briefly because I think they're somewhat more obvious, I hope. But, God, I would say, in creation, God intended us to live in community with other animals. And so the fact that we have so disturbed our relationship with other animals that now our relationship and our contact with other animals, like the pangolin in China, has become a source of threat to us. And we can lament that. We should lament that, but we can see that we're supposed to be in touch with other animals. That's a good thing. And similarly, we're supposed to be in touch with one another. And this growth of global relationships, the fact that we can do this at all, I celebrate. I am honored to be here with you. And I do think that this is a reflection of some kind of God's hope for humanity, that we would be able to relate to one another. And so global human sociality, just because globalization has been the conduit of COVID-19, doesn't invalidate the goodness of global human social relationships. And similarly, identity. I think it's become very popular to complain about identity politics. And I'm always cautious when I hear people say that about, identity politics is bad. Because, coming to maturity involves coming to be able to see oneself and to be able to name oneself. And of course, we draw our language from our world. But on the individual and community levels, being able to name both our similarity and our differences from one another is part of our healthy growth. And so when someone's identifying as queer or as Muslim or as, pick your identity, I think that's part of this process of coming to mature naming of one's community identity. And our identities are not meant to be the same. And so the diversity of this creation, the coming to maturity and coming to inhabit an identity, again, a dynamic identity, not a kind of closed off static reality, but a dynamic identity in relationship in which we name our differences as well as our similarities, I think is a healthy part of God's good creation. So moving on to thinking about COVID-19 in the midst of God's fallen creation, still a good creation, of course, but a creation in which certain moral possibilities, structural possibilities have been realized. Well, viruses are also parasites. And essentially they attack cells and eat the proteins and then use that as food to reproduce themselves. So this structure that that makes possible our lives, the virus that makes human embryos able to receive nutrients is also gives us the flu and gives us COVID-19, among many other viruses, polio or others. So viruses are parasites, and harmful viruses are destructive and do violence to us. And these other, I've kind of already mentioned these, so I'll just go briefly through them. We've clearly, this virus is transmitted because of the ways that we have developed our global society. And I want to be careful here. I say we, but the North Atlantic societies, the Northern Europe, or Western Europe, and North America has been the kind of engine of this process. And that's not to take away from the Chinese doing their part in the last couple of decades, certainly. But we need to be clear about how this, historically, how this process, this form of economy, this form of culture that lives in a massively destructive way. I mean, it does come from the same kind of white settler colonial evangelical theology that Reverend Lamar was naming, that Perdien was sharing. And so our global relationships have taken the form of global, these global capitalism, and through relations that have been created by through colonialism, and so forth. And so those, however good this possibility of connecting is, we also, of course, have to be mindful of the ways that it's been deeply distorted. And COVID-19, some people talk about COVID-19 as the great equalizer, and it's true that I could get it and find out that I have some health issue I had no idea about, and I could die from it. But it's far more likely, let's just talking about the United States, it's far more likely that if I were elderly, if I were poor, if I were African American or Latino, it's far more likely if I, worked in, the informal labor market in Latin America. Yeah. So it's not the great equalizer because our global relations are structured by this history of capitalism and colonialism. So, and it's also the case that as we come to mature identification, self and communal identification, that some of those identities are seen as threatening, and are in fact threatening for a good reason, to the caretakers and the dominant classes. And so those identities, the people who inhabit those identities, are permanently policed, and that's exactly what we're seeing with police brutality and murder of African Americans, of trans people, and others. So we need to be clear about, naming. So our vision is kind of calibrated by our conviction of the goodness of God's earth and God's creation, and thinking about COVID-19 in light of some of these structural possibilities for that. I would say, as a Christian, that God has gifted us, and yet those structural possibilities can be realized and are realized in violent, deeply harmful ways. And so my final comment here, as we move kind of from some of the seeing to thinking about how we might act on this, is, and I asked this question, redeeming COVID-19, I don't think we're going to have like COVID-19 as our best friend in a few years or something like that. Who knows what will happen with COVID-19? I mean, there's speculation that this virus that enables our embryos to get nutrients, that it was harmful to us potentially at one point, but that over time it became kind of just part there. 8% of the human genome is made up of viral DNA strands, and that's viruses that used to infect us but don't anymore, and they're just part of what we walk around with. But so I want to be cautious here how we talk about redeeming COVID-19, but I do think what does it mean to think about participating in the work of God in the world? To think about what God is doing right now, and as a people of faith, a people who want to align ourselves with God's love and justice, what would that look like? And so, I think this is an apocalyptic moment, and apocalypse means, in the first place, a revealing, an unveiling, and this is not an apocalyptic moment, probably, if you were on the bottom of society, because this is what you expect from society, unfortunately. But for many, and unfortunately, many theologians, people, middle class people, oh wow, things are this bad. These are the structures that shape our world. This is the history. To have to face why African Americans are dying at a so much higher rate in the United States, which it has to do with a history that goes back to slavery. You have to face that. It's a moment of revealing, and it enables a renewed resistance to global injustice. And so the protests and the writing, the agitation for new forms of relationship, new structural, new politics, apocalyptic can fuel this sense, that the kind of highly dramatic sense that everything must change, that the way of the world is completely unjust, and must be overthrown, and that rightly motivates, brings about a lot of anger and motivates people to get involved and try to push for a new world. And that's part of what I think we need to see God is doing, is in revealing the structures of our world, revealing the global injustice to a new depth. It's making possible a new kind of resistance to that. And so we need to join that resistance. But apocalypse, I think one of the nice things about having a canon of scripture, having lots of, the Bible as a little library, is we have different genre of literature in the Bible, and apocalyptic says everything is wrong. We must change it, and that's I think that's that judgment, that sense of revealing and judgment, divine judgment, is really important. But there's also this wisdom literature that says, there's a call to the ordinary, everyday kind of work that goes alongside with that kind of more kind of dramatic resistance. There's the developing communities, local communities of caring for each other. And in a community of care, this is really important. In a community of care, we listen to one another. And so we hear how each other are identifying themselves. And we think about, okay, well, how can I come alongside you and meet the needs that you're naming, that you're asking for help with? And what are my needs? And how can we become mutually vulnerable to one another? So this is a different form of identity politics, because it involves us being in relationship with each other and listening carefully to how we are identifying ourselves and our needs and our desire, not just our needs, because we are needy, all of us. We're all vulnerable and needy, but we're also all desiring. We all have hopes and desires. So if we can listen to how each other articulates our needs and desires, And that, a lot of that needs to take place in a local level. And that's why I have this picture here. I found an Indonesian doctor and a patient here. So, and obviously a hospital is one site of care. But my hope is that our churches can be communities of care, of learning to help one another mature and speak our needs and our desires, and to come alongside one another. Our needs and desires for health, that's basic, but also beyond that, for love, for community, for deep connection with our earth and with God. So I think there's a wisdom theology that we can develop here of the ordinary everyday work in communities of caring for one another. And finally, I'll talk about a spirit politics, because the Spirit is the one who leads us in all truth. And we need the Spirit to, help us think about, as theologians, how do we make the case that, that the scientific research really matters? So many Christians in this country, at least, are so suspicious of science as opposed to faith.
Right.
But the Spirit leads us into truth, and scientists have long been helping Christians let go of some of our idolatry of what we think we must believe to know and trust God. And so that's part of it, but also how do we share information in a trustworthy way? How do we communicate information in a way that both inspires bold action and increases trust, bonds of trust? The Spirit is the Spirit of life, the Spirit of breath, the Spirit who hovered, over the deep, who breathes life into us. And so the Spirit is the one who is violated God violated alongside George Floyd as his breath is extinguished. Mm-hmm. So if we want to stand with the Spirit, we have to stand with people like George Floyd, so that they may keep breathing, so they may survive. I think the womanist theological emphasis on survival is really important to keep in mind here. We ask for liberation, so we talk about the apocalyptic damnation of the unjust structures, but we also talk about the Spirit of life who enables survival.
Right.
And the Spirit is also the one who comes alongside us and helps us learn to form bonds of community, to be the fellowship of the Holy Spirit. And so we can have, again, truthful, just forms of communication, of relating to one another, so that we might form communities, so we might have global structures that are just and caring and loving. So that's my approach, as I've been thinking about it, to doing theology in a time of COVID-19. Again, I'm really honored that you invited me to share some of these thoughts, and I'd love to engage you in conversation now.
Just one little comment to me about your last slide here. I don't know if you draw these points from whether it's from the genre of the Bible, but I'm just curious, like at the first point you say about apocalypse, the second point you said about wisdom. So I'm interested to add another, maybe about the gospel, the biography of the people, or as McClendon said, theology is a biography, right? So how you understand other stories, how you understand people's stories. I'm just curious about adding one more point here.
Yeah, well, I did think about trying to talk about this as a Trinitarian, the judgment of God,
exactly,
the wisdom of Christ, and the suffering of the community, the Spirit of life.
You're right.
But I do think you're right that, and part of that, the version of narrative theology that you're describing does, I think, enable us to see the way that theology is lived.
Yes.
And so when we engage in theological debate, whether that's some of these white evangelicals that Reverend Lamar was talking about, or whether that's in this conversation or whomever we're talking to see the way that our particular beliefs take form and whole in ways of life.
Right.
And that that in some ways, I hope it will increase our compassion for one another as we engage each other. But it also makes the work much harder. And for people from the white evangelical background, for instance, that's why repentance is a lot harder, because it's not just, okay, well, I'll just change some words around. I've got to change my whole life.
So Jamie, this is a really fascinating, rich effort of theology to see COVID-19. I think all of my friends here and our audience in Indonesia will agree with me, right? I mean, this is really fascinating, Jamie. I mean, how you could draw something even from Berkov, and you can connect that with our situation, our recent situation now. So thank you, Jamie. I just want to highlight several things here. I think really interesting on how you see COVID-19 reveals, especially this apocalypse, right? About several things. First, it reveals about our human health fragility, but not only about our fragility in our health, but also about the fragility in our economic system, and about the greediness of our capitalistic world, which you conclude in one term: global injustice.
Yeah.
So what I really interesting in your effort in theologizing COVID-19 is that, because like in Indonesia, Jamie, many people in Indonesia only crying about their own situation, only like begging, how like lament, how long, oh God, and because of this event really give huge impact on their economic and financial things. But you try to make us see not only about ourselves, our problems, but how God still works in this hard situation.
Right.
And how the church could involve bringing God's redemption in our world.
Yes.
Jamie, thank you. This is a really, really great perspective. Okay, friends, do you have some question? And dan pemirsa di Indonesia, kalau Anda ingin bertanya, silakan memberikan komen dan pertanyaan dalam bahasa Indonesia, tidak masalah. Dalam bahasa Inggris boleh. So if you want to give some comments or your questions in Indonesia, that's fine. That's totally fine. Okay, teman-teman, friends, do you have some question to Jamie? Maybe you want to shaping more our discussion here. Okay.
I will let other friends who would like to comment on Jamie's presentation. Please feel free.
Jamie, can you close your presentation so that
I'm sorry.
we can see our beautiful faces here.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the.
I think I have one question, Jamie. If I'm not wrong, according to Berkov, Principalities and Powers, like you said in your third points, church is really important to bring God's redeeming work in the world, right? But then this is my question: how you see, how can the church bring God's redeeming works in the world today, while the church really divide into political interest now? Because like in the US now, I think not only in the US, Jamie, if I can tell you, I think my friend will agree with me, this situation in the US really affected the church even in Indonesia too. I mean, the huge divide between Republican and Democrats in the US, and how this political polarization brings huge impact in the church, also happened, Jamie, in Indonesia.
Right.
Maybe you will feel it's really weird, but that's the truth. That's the truth. So my question is, how can the church now bring God's redeeming work while we are so divided now, while we are so polarized? I mean, we divide into the polarization now, political polarization.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in the first place, so this is a lesson that Mennonites are learning the hard way, is that the church at its best participates by grace in what God is doing. Because Mennonites have often talked about the church, basically the church has it all figured out. the church is doing it all right. The rest of the world's messed up. So if the church can just, the church just does it right, and then that's, so I think it's important to say that God is at work.
Okay.
And the church is participating. It's trying to participate by grace, trying to join what God is doing. And so I do think obviously John 17, this Christ prayer, high priestly prayer for the unity of his followers, still resonates, and it resonates ever more. As part of what's revealed is the way these inequalities are killing us.
You're right.
And these inequalities exist in the church. They exist in the church at national levels, and they exist at local. They exist in our congregations, but they also exist between churches. And it's a call for bodies, for our global church bodies, both whether they're Mennonite or Reformed or the ecumenical bodies, to really we've got to work at this at a global level to address these inequalities. And Paul knew, this is part of what Luke depicts in Acts, and Paul talks about at various places, that the economic inequalities in the church are deadly.
Interesting.
And the economic inequalities, the cultural inequalities that Paul talks about, or Pauline author in Ephesians 2, as being overcome in Christ, like these cultural and economic divisions are killing us, and they're killing us in the church. And so if the church wants to participate in what God is doing and be a sign and witness to the world, which I think we're called to be, we do have to face that. And and the good news is that the truth is we won't figure it out. We're not going to be perfect. And Mennonites really struggle to admit that. So,
Right.
But we're not going to be perfect, and it's really important to acknowledge that we're not going to be perfect. And so that's why it's important to emphasize God's grace. And it's important to emphasize that we actually learn the church through relationships with one another, through people from other religions, people from no religion. We learn by being in partnership and coalition with others, because we don't own what God is doing in the world. We have to learn that, and we learn that from others as well. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. Bu Jess mungkin mau nanya?
Unmute.
Please
Di
unmute.
unmute.
Jessica, can you unmute your microphone?
Sorry,
Okay,
sorry.
perfect.
Thank you, Jamie, for your presentation. I really appreciate your views about COVID-19 and how we doing our theology in COVID-19. I want to ask two questions for you. I just want to know your response to my question. Is it okay?
Yes, please.
Okay, I have two questions. The first question is, so in Indonesia, there are many Christians and theologians who still believe that God determined everything in this world. Even the law of nature is determined by God, not just permitted. Okay, and of course, it's include COVID-19. God determined COVID-19 too, and they believe that God has a greater good plan behind it. So, what is your response to these views? And the second one is from the philosophical views of Leibniz. Leibniz said that the best possible world that God could create is our world now, a world which contains viruses. You said earlier that there are some good viruses, right? Well, maybe it's not perfect, but for Leibniz, it is the best that God can do, or it is the best that God can create. our world now. Now, what's your response to this view? I'm sorry if my English is
No, it's
I
very
hope you
clear.
can
It's very,
understand
very good.
my question
At least you
clearly.
can say something in English rather than Jamie say something in Indonesia.
Oh yeah.
But to add on that, I think, may I add on Jessica's first question, especially the question regarding whether God determines or God wills or permits. I think this is really pastoral, I think, and many lay people, many church people ask this: where is
Yeah.
God? What God is really doing in the time of COVID, whether God really
Yeah.
wills this. So how would you respond to that question, Dr. Pitts?
Wow.
Thank you.
No, thanks for adding that, Ninju, and thanks, Jessica, for the original questions. You express yourself very clear, and the only problem is my own lack of abilities here. These are massive questions that I'll only be able to touch on inadequately. But on the question of determinism, yeah, I mean, I think that view has so many problems from a biblical perspective. It's just not. It's not how the narratives within Scripture show God to be interacting with creation. And kind of from a theological and philosophical perspective, the kind of simple opposition between freedom and determinism falls apart because, of course, freedom is conditioned, but freedom also has its own, what some would call it can be called an emergent property from specific conditions. It has its own, it's not absolute freedom, and that's where some of these debates get hung up. Unless you have absolute freedom, then you have determinism. Well, no, you have, thinking structurally is helpful here because we have freedom is a freedom within certain structures, and it's a freedom for action, for thought, and so forth within certain structural limits. It's always conditioned and limited, but that doesn't make it not real. And I think from biblical and theological grounds, we can say that God is reliable, and that's where the pastoral language needs to come in. That God is completely reliable. So we don't need a theory of divine determination to teach us that God is reliable. We look at the overarching narrative of Scripture in which God meets the worst death with new life, and that's our response, I think, to this. Whereas God is at work in the voices, in the doctors, in the ones protesting and agitating for structural transformation, so that the kind of inequality. We're always going to have viruses in this world, but the way that they become massive pandemics, as we're seeing in front of us, is because of these inequalities. And so the political movements to confront the inequalities is also the site of divine action affecting change. But so we trust in the reliability of God, even when, in our personal lives or in our world, we see violence and pain. But that violence and pain is mutable. And, we would, as Christians, Christianity has this kind of conversionary aspect of it. That doesn't make any sense if everything's determined. Mm-hmm. That just doesn't make any sense. And no theological argument I've ever seen to try to make those fit works from my perspective. Mm-hmm. God, and that doesn't, again, God is creating structural possibilities for freedom of choice in certain determined ways, certain specific ways, but that choice is real. Mm-hmm. That freedom is real, and our ability to change our world, it's very hard, It's extremely hard, but it's possible. And that's the other side of the pastoral. The pastoral position, I think, needs to be both the calling to trust in God's reliability and the enduring goodness of God's world, but also the pastoral challenge to get involved as we trust God, to get involved to change our situation. So, and then, and Leibniz, wow. I mean, I guess if you need a theory to square that circle, then maybe that is helpful, but I don't think we need a theory about this. I think we this is the world we live in. There's violence in this world. The goodness of the world endures, and in our local communities and in our global interconnections, we are called to care and to seek justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we need to get hung up on kind of theoretical questions around, is this the best possible world or not? It's the one we have. So how do we live well in it?
Wait, can I?
Yosia.
Can I add something?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
because we
Sure.
talk about what the church do, right? Amid the pandemic. But thank you very much, Jamie, for your presentation. I very enjoy your presentation, and that was fascinating. And I was thinking while I hear your presentation, are you sure that you're not a Reformed theologian? Are you sure you're a Mennonite?
Boy.
Just kidding. but thank you very much for bringing up the power framework in your discussion. And I think when we talk about power, I think it's become more real in the term of capital or money. I mean, in my opinion, when we talk about like work from home, I think that's a privilege from someone who got money like that, more money. I mean, being rich is not wrong. I just seeing from that kind of perspective. I mean, and like in the midst of COVID pandemic, the one who can use or steer the opinion in social media is the one who have more money. Because if you don't have money, you don't have time to add something
creating
like that,
hoax.
Right? But I think in the perspective of power, I think money or capital become power, right? So it's like and there's a disparity. I mean, what I want to say is you're right about COVID-19 uncover the structural sin in our society. The one who don't have money become more powerless and more incapacitate like that because of the virus, and the one who have money more safe because they have capital to save themselves. But I am wondering, I mean, let's say that if everything is normal again, I mean, we know this structural sin because of COVID, but what if our world become better again and there's no COVID-19?
Sure.
And I think, will people still remember, I mean, this kind of thing, because everything will become normal, and the structural sin will it's like we don't know, right? So I want to ask, I mean, the discussion is, so what after the COVID? I think what should we do? That's the problem, right? It's become a crucial problem for us because we're still in the midst of pandemic. But what if the pandemic is gone like that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think we have to take advantage of the apocalyptic moment with the revealing. And so it is to some of these structural inequalities that you're talking about are more apparent. They're more clear to a larger number of people. So how do we use this moment when people are actually kind of forced to look at that and say, we don't have to live like this? And what kind of steps can we take in this moment, but what kind of ways can we prepare? And that's why I talk both about the apocalyptic, the clamoring for a new system. We saw this in Minneapolis in the last couple of days, where they said they were going to take their police force apart. I mean, that's a wonderful apocalyptic result. You know, and the reality is that in a year, we'll have some. If you live in Minneapolis, there'll still be police. Police will still be doing unjust things. But it is possible now to take some steps. And part of those steps are through the kind of the radical, damnation, I think is a good theological word, of the systems that lead to this kind of dramatic change. But also part of it is that kind of everyday work that we have to do regardless, because like you say, even if people don't realize it, those inequalities are still there. Those inequalities persist. And so what can we do now in the moments of drama, and how can we prepare, how can we make use of the time well, both to make some big changes, to take some big steps, but also to prepare the ground for what's coming. And, you know, this is something that I've come to really believe strongly, is that we must look at these moments historically. And that means seeing exactly what you're seeing, is that in 2 years, probably, it's possible that COVID will do lots of things that we don't expect, but probably we won't really be talking about this. We won't really think, it'll probably be, you know, on average, it seems like every 10 years or so, something really big happens. And then, oh my gosh, things are bad. They're poor people.
And the same, right?
But that's why we need to have a historical perspective and to see ourselves through these, and to be reminding people in 5 years, and to be saying, hey, remember that? Well, that's coming again. And because, you know, in this country, and I think around the world, 10 years ago, we had this whole financial crisis. Okay, well, oh, wow, the systems are so terrible. Well, guess what? 5 years later, they were much worse. So I think we have to be really, really wise and careful about, again, that kind of everyday politics of taking steps to realize, yes, there can be some significant changes today, but the long work happens when you're talking about when people have forgotten. So what can we put into place now?
Well, thank you.
Nindyo, I think you want to ask a question.
Yes, but I think I will keep from asking first because we have questions from Dr. Arvin Go here. Chaper, you want to read?
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for Arvin. So his question is, given the complex network of power structures with regards to COVID-19, scientists, politicians, economists, and the marginalized, how would you do a theological ethics based on these power structures? I think he has the second question. Should we prioritize the marginalized, or maybe according to Yoder, or should we empower the scientists in determining ethical guidelines? How do you navigate through these power structures?
That's a wonderful and another very difficult question. And I'd be curious what some of your, I know some of you think about this kind of thing a lot too. So I would love to hear others as well. But my view, okay, how do you do with theological ethics with the complexity of the power structures in view? That's how I'm understanding that question. Maybe I'm wrong, but yeah. So I think that it's why it's important. So from my perspective, a theological ethics needs to have some clear vision about what's orienting it, and so that's why I talk about this. That's why I use the Theology of the Principalities and Powers to talk about to affirm the goodness of complex dynamic structuration. Because some of the way we talk about politics, and I'll say Yoder would be very guilty of this, is to say, oh, we just can have this one simple little community that's perfect, and it somehow is kind of like isolated from these other systems. But that's neither sociologically realistic, nor is it theologically good news. Because theologically, the good news is that we have been created to be in relationship into this whole wide network of relationship. And so the church is not created to be this closed system, this simple structure. The church is created, the church exists within and in relation to this whole network. And so I think cultivating our vision for God's redemptive purposes, of God's action in the world, kind of in the midst of these powers, is central for us. And that means, because of the complexity of the structures, it means, obviously, it means being like Jesus. And this is, and so it means a very clear solidarity with the most marginalized. So I do think that's a kind of basic posture of Christian ethics. If we think of the kind of classical medieval way of thinking about God and theology is to talk about the relations between beauty, truth, and the good. And so one of the things we're learning right now is that good science can serve the needs of people, of the marginalized. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think we should play these off, and that does get into complexities, who you fund and so forth. But hey, if if the U.S. government weren't putting a huge portion of its budget into the military, we would have plenty of money to fund both, both people, the most marginals, and the scientists. So these should not be played off of each other. And similarly, when we talk about good social science and economics that pay attention to history and class dynamics, so that we can think about how to have a shared life together that moves hopefully toward a way of life in which there's less inequality. These shouldn't be alternatives. So I think we have to work at both. I think we have to, it's right to call for funding for scientists, but we do that with our clear vision, and our vision is clearly on Christ's option for the marginalized, for God's preferential option for the poor. That has to be at our center, but that doesn't mean not caring about science. This doesn't mean, I said beauty as well. It doesn't mean not caring about art. And we see in all these protests, whether it's music or visual art or so forth, that these have their own integrity and their own central role to play in creating a common life that is just and caring for all.
Interesting.
I think we have another question from our audience, right? Okay. This is from Reddy. Mm-hmm. I've always got the impression Bible seldom talks about health. The health issue always looks like some punishment or need to bear by himself. How does a theology address this issue?
Wonderful question, and I think Jesus addresses it. When he talks about the Tower of Siloam not being, he says some people say it's the fault of the people, some people say it's, I don't remember exactly the line, but the fault of the parents. And he says essentially the tower just fell. And I think the Bible talks a lot. One of Jesus's focal points of Jesus' ministry is healing. Mm-hmm. And in our talk about justice, about just social relations, sometimes we miss the centrality of healing. And Pentecostals, talking to Jessica here, yes. Pentecostals really get this well about Jesus's ministry. Jesus is about healing. Now, again, as we're talking about with COVID-19, social injustice breeds pandemic. It breeds poor health and so forth. So the pursuit of justice is very much tied up with the pursuit of health. But also, if we want to be like Jesus, we have to care about health. And I become more and more, as I've kind of reconciled some with my own Pentecostal background, that's part of what I've kind of been restored to me, is realizing, well, the Holy Spirit is a healer. And that's really good news if you're in a pandemic. It's really good news if you are suffering the effects, the psychological effects of sexual abuse, for instance. That Jesus is the healer. The Spirit brings healing. We really need to keep that emphasis as well. So thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. Nindya or Adi, do you have a question? Adi, okay.
Hello, Jamie. Sorry, I just joined. I have a technical matter.
I understand. It's okay.
Thanks for your presentation. I really appreciate and I enjoy it. But don't worry, I follow your presentation from the start. If my response, I note several things from your presentation. I began to dare to think that death is the cycle of rebirth, and the suffering is not the works of sin, but the pain of birth from universe or new system or something like that. And I just remember the one theologian's name's Paul Tillich. Theology says courage, and Tillich talks about courage content a holistic perspective. Courage is part of a broader role in the fulfillment of personal faith. There is courage to accept the fact that we are supposed to be power of being in which every creation participate. If I may summarize into the three part, courage to open up to reality, courage to open to accept the reality, and courage beyond reality, goes to beyond reality. What it's interesting that Tillich began by starting that courage is linked to the doubt and the risk of the life of life. Yeah, you think Tillich, in my opinion, is appreciate doubt, and I may add more. Yosia also mentioned it earlier. If you talk about character ethic, especially in Christianity, change character must start from internal factor, from self-awareness, not external factor. Yeah, maybe it's okay. This time we start the self-exchange starting from external factor, the namely is pandemic, but we must realize that external factors are very temporary. In my opinion, we must change because self-awareness of our internal factor. Because if we don't realize this, I think the sky will be dirty again. The earth will be like before, and I think the church can be example that community of character begin. Thank you. Sorry,
Yeah,
my
thank you,
parents.
That's fascinating. You said a lot, so I probably won't be able to respond to all of it. But I want to touch on a couple of points that you raised that are really interesting. You started talking about suffering, and I think back to Bernardin's introduction here with this criticism of white evangelicalism. White evangelicalism, arguably, it's what it deals least adequately with is the theology of suffering. And it's very difficult to talk theologically about suffering without justifying someone's suffering. And that that's where you go wrong. That's one way to go wrong with the theology of suffering, is to, in some ways, to justify someone's suffering. And the other way is to, or at least one significant other way is to ignore suffering, to ignore its reality in our lives, the complex character of suffering, which some of it comes from, as you were kind of saying, I think impersonal structures that, a big earthquake could happen and the chasm could open here in Elkhart and Perdi, and I could be sucked in. And, that's very different than, or COVID-19. I mean, is complex because it's obviously humans did not invent COVID-19, but human social patterns are largely responsible for how it's spread. And its worst impacts have, as I've been talking about, have been massively exacerbated because of our social inequalities. So the distinction, the classical distinction between natural evil and moral evil, I think we're seeing with global climate change, and with something like COVID-19, you're seeing how those are the barriers between those are becoming far more blurry. So how do you talk about that suffering? Acknowledging its reality, acknowledging that it's something, being a community of character and a community of care means suffering with people. And it means learning to suffer through, and that's where the kind of, I think, the positive use of a theology of the cross, to see that Christ is in solidarity with the suffering. Christ comes alongside us, not to justify anybody's suffering, but to be present transformatively in the long term, we hope, at least. So on being a community of character, I don't think taking personal and communal virtues seriously should be an alternative to thinking really carefully about social structures and politics and so forth, because again, the church is always shaped deeply by the surrounding society, and you're right that COVID-19, as Josiah was mentioning, COVID-19 may not be here in 2 years, but we've had essentially a basic kind of global structure of capitalism that's gone up through a bunch of changes, but in the last 500 years, there's been a fairly stable global order that's emerged. And Britain, then the U.S., we have deeply misshapen global relations that are enduring. Patterns of racism are deeply enduring, and patterns of sexism. Obviously, that's the whole, in many of our societies, at least, our conceptions of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman are deeply, the church doesn't just escape those, and they've been around for thousands of years, and they are deeply misshaping us. They're forces of violence. That doesn't mean that's all they are, but they are also that. And so being a community of character, which I strongly endorse, it does mean, again, I do think it means getting very clear in our vision. I wouldn't describe myself as a virtue ethicist, because I do think this sense of orienting vision is primary. And it is in some characters, it is in some virtue ethics too, but the virtues, when we talk about being formed as excellent people, and that's what being virtuous means, being excellent. Well, our criteria for excellence are always changing contextually. And so we always have to take account of our context, and we always have to wrestle critically with the criteria for excellence that we inherit from our culture, from the church, and so forth. And so there's no once and for all stable pattern of what it means to be a virtuous person and what it means to be a, virtuous, reformed professor outside of Jakarta, like Jessica, what it means to be a virtuous Mennonite theologian in Elkhart, Indiana, are not the exact same thing. And what it means to be our communities, we can learn from one each other, and we must learn from one another, all of us, I think, which is why I'm so grateful to be here with you. But again, that's a really long way, of saying that our formation of character as individuals and as communities is always bound up with critical reflection and action on on the world as a whole as well, on our societies.
And what I appreciate from you and what I'm hearing from you, from your presentation, Dr. Pitts, is that you rooted your proposal in the Trinitarian framework, which I rarely see among Mennonite theologians, if I may expose this.
Very well.
This is really, really
well.
enlightening, and that you try to see God reveals the structures of injustice, and that God also resists those global injustices. And you also see Jesus as the wisdom working in communities of care and spirit, which spirit politics. And this is really enlightening, and thank you for that. So I don't have any questions, but I just want to highlight that.
And Indio, by the way, I really like JB's term, spirit of politics. I think.
Yeah.
I think that's a new term. Maybe someday you can make a paper about that, JB.
Yes. Well, this is my current writing project.
Oh yeah. I forgot about it.
I've actually been writing on that a lot.
Well, yeah.
Great.
But yeah, I mean, Nindio, thank you for recognizing that. Yeah, I do strive to be a Trinitarian theologian, and there's a variety of reasons behind that. And you're right that Mennonites have not excelled in Trinitarian thought, but I think it's really important. I think it helps us see a fuller picture of God and God's work in the world. It helps us avoid some of the pitfalls of being too narrowly focused on, one kind of human project or one human interest or another. And yeah, so I try to be, and I guess in my responses to some of your questions, I try to be an inclusive thinker. That's my goal. And so when you talk about, when Adi talks about being community character, I want to say yes. And communities that are deeply, passionately involved in their art, seeking social justice. I want to talk about God's reliable shaping of the world and the freedom that God gives us to change and transform our world, and so forth. So, and this to me has its root theologically in a Trinitarian theology.
Wow, I look forward to seeing that project unfolds.
Me too.
Yeah, good luck with your writing project. But Nindio, I have a conspiracy. I guess that Jamie is Reformed theologian inside.
Yeah, that's because of me. So I
Canadian has corrupted me.
And Canadian is Mennonite theologian inside. That's conspiracy.
So Jamie, thank you. This is a really great conversation, Jamie. And I think we still have so many questions because your explanation about COVID-19 and how it's relating with theology is just so wow. I mean, it's fascinating. And
I do have many questions.
It's so fascinating, Jamie. I mean, we are so inspired by your talking, and I think our audience too will really, really blessed by your insights. And we hope that this is not the last time, Jamie. So, and we can arrange another time. And thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jamie. So,
thank you all. This has been really rich. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Maybe Jamie, your last comments about the recent situation, whether in the U.S. or around the world, and what is your hope?
Wow. Yeah, my hope, I mean, concretely, I would hope that initiatives like we've seen in Minneapolis to a shift towards new communal forms of caretaking that strongly de-emphasize the use of armed force in maintaining our community safety. I think that would be good news if it spread in this country, but also elsewhere in the world. Berdian and I have talked a lot about policing in Indonesia.
Yeah.
And that's another interesting conversation. I would love to learn from all of you more about that. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'll say my hope is for that the world would turn and that we would see health and justice, that we would see the breath of the Spirit giving life to all people, but particularly to those whose lives have been devalued, whose breath has been stolen.
Yes.
That we would have a renewed earth, and that, you know, as I said, global relations are good, and that means that we would get to hang out more and talk about all of this stuff more. So I hope that.
Yes. And hopefully someday with coffee, Jamie.
Yes, indeed. In person.
In person. Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you, guys. And thank you, friends in Indonesia. This is a great talk, and see you again tomorrow. I think tomorrow we will have another session, right?
Wow.
With you?
Lydia? Yes. No, I'm just a trigger for discussion. So tomorrow we will have a discussion about the early church and humanitarian works.
Wow.
No, I'm not leading the discussion, Jamie. Just trigger the discussion. So thank you, guys. Thank you, Jamie. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you all.